In this video, we're going to talk about keyboard shortcuts. Now, there are definitely things that I use keyboard shortcuts for, and definitely things that I don't use keyboard shortcuts for. In my opinion, it all comes down to efficiency and what the best way is to do any given task. Now, keyboard shortcuts that I do use are things like, well, once I have an object, we'll see what the difference is here. So I use keyboard shortcuts to turn on and off edge faces, so that's F4. I also use keyboard shortcuts to go back and forth to wireframe view. So I can turn that on and off. We can also, once I have an object selected and converted to an editable poly, I can also move through the sub-object states using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's, in my opinion, a really good way to move between sub-object states. There's other things too, like I'll use G to toggle the grid on and off in each viewport. There are a lot of times where I don't like having the grid visible. It tends to get visually in the way of a lot of things that I do. Other things like Alt-W, I use keyboard shortcut for all the time to toggle the minimize and maximize the viewport. Alt-Q is another good one that when I have my object selected, Alt-Q will isolate the object. Let's add a couple other objects to our scene so you can see a little bit more about what's going on there. So if I have multiple objects here in my view, whichever one happens to be selected when I hit Alt-Q, or multiples may be selected when I hit Alt-Q. So let's select this one also when I hit Alt-Q. So what it does is it isolates those objects in the view so that they're the only things available when I'm actually working. If I've got a whole bunch of objects in my scene and a lot of things overlap each other, being able to isolate the selection to those given objects is a really nice thing to be able to do. Other things that I look for keyboard shortcuts are things that I do often. And if I do the same kind of task over and over and over, I tend to try to remember the keyboard shortcut for that operation. Now, as I look through the menus, I will see all kinds of different things that have keyboard shortcuts. Again, if I'm doing things often, I'm going to try to remember those keyboard shortcuts. Select all, Control A. That's a Windows standard keyboard shortcut for most things that you can do. Control V for clone, also pretty much a standard shortcut. A lot of other applications force you to hit Control C to copy it before you can hit Control V and paste it. Within 3ds Max, you can clone an object just by hitting Control V. It'll just be whichever object happens to be selected. So again, lots of different keyboard shortcuts, but personally, I tend to really only worry about using keyboard shortcuts that I do often. I really like Control C for creating a camera from any given view. So as I orbit around and get the view where I want it to be, zoom in, zoom out, pan, do whatever we need to do, when I hit Control C, it will create a camera in my scene and change my perspective view, or whatever view I happen to be looking through, to that camera view. I tend to always do this in a perspective view so that I'm creating a camera with those projections. So again, it's a really good way to be able to work. Now, again, as I right-click over things and I see certain shortcuts that I'm going to use often, I'll use those. So since now I can't move my camera view nearly as effectively, quite often I'll hit P to switch back to my perspective view, and then again be able to move around and arc rotate around any given object. And then again, if I decide I like this view better, I can hit Control C to create a new camera and switch to it. So, in my opinion, keyboard shortcuts can be incredibly valuable, but I tend to really only worry about remembering the ones that I use often, or remembering ones where I drive to menus a lot of times, and then I'll try to remember those keyboard shortcuts to make my work more efficient, so I'm not constantly driving to menus, so that I can use keyboard shortcuts, again, to be more efficient.